Hello and welcome back to the Prospect Podcast. I'm Ellen Halliday.
And I'm Ilona Ferber.
This week we are pleased to be joined by writer and lawyer Philippe Sands. Philippe's most recent book, 38 Londres Street on Impunity, Pinochet in England and a Nazi in Patagonia, was published earlier this month.
Lovely to be with you. Very lovely.
When we look at America, we're looking at an administration that sounds intent on territorial expansion. It's talked about Panama, it's talked about Greenland, it's talked about Canada, things we couldn't have imagined. It's an administration which is curtailing freedom of speech. I'm thinking of Mahmoud Khalil, or the detention of the Tufts PhD student, Rumesa Öztürk, who was taken in broad daylight. As a lawyer who has spent his career working on international law, human rights law, what would be your dispassionate assessment of America today and how well it is protecting and upholding these questions of human rights and international justice?
Warning signs flashing very strong and long and bright. I mean, I've just come back from a couple of weeks in the US, went to New York to give a lecture, went to California to give a lecture, visit our daughter who's doing her PhD there. And it's extremely worrisome. You'll recall in 38 Londres Street, I do deal with those early days of Pinochet and what he did. And, banning of books, deporting people, removing the military from office, removing the civil servants from office, replacing them with your own people. It looks horribly familiar. The playbook is very, very familiar. And the logical question one has to ask is, when will people start being disappeared off the street? And it's happening. It's happening in relation not only to foreigners with visas, but also people with green cards. What happens next? Does it happen next to people who have dual nationality and they strip one nationality? Do they start actually doing the same with their own nationals, some of whom apparently are having trouble being questioned at the border? So there is a path that's being taken. And in this context, the crucial institution in the United States, as it was in Chile under Pinochet's rule, is the courts. Will they be independent? Will they stand up to this? And at this point, I think the judges in the US are doing a pretty good job. And many cases have been filed, many cases are being brought, and interim relief injunctions are being given in relation to certain things, not in relation to others, but I think the judges are acting very independently. Ultimately, it will go to a single court. It will go to the Supreme Court of the United States. And we all know that last July, apropos Pinochet, the Supreme Court gave a ruling on immunity for the acts of a former president, and it ruled that there is a presumption of immunity for any official act. That is not the approach taken by the House of Lords, as I describe in 38 Londres Street, in relation to international crimes. And so that becomes the issue. And I think the two key individuals right now in the United States are going to be Amy Coney Barrett, one of the justices of the Supreme Court, and John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The courts were also central in Chilean life. And one of the dramas that I will surely encounter in my visit to Chile in the coming days is the reveal that the deal between Chile and the United Kingdom required Chile to strip Augusto Pinochet of the immunity he had given himself. It's all about immunity. And I am able to reveal in the book a conversation taking place between the president of Chile, Mr. Frey, and the president of the Chilean Supreme Court, at which the president basically, as I understand it, says to the president of the Supreme Court, when he's back, you strip him of his immunity. And that's exactly what happened. Now, that undermines the rule of law, the idea of a personal intervention, although, as you'll have seen in the book, it's what Pinochet used to do the whole time. When there was a risk of him being extradited to United States, or his mates being extradited to the United States, what does he do? He goes to the president of the Supreme Court and he says, I'll write this judgment. And he strengthens, shall we say, a judgment. So the courts have a crucial place. I've got to assume that in the United States, the idea of a president going to the president of the Supreme Court and saying, this is what you're going to do, is not going to happen. But who knows? They would have said the same thing in Germany in 1933, and everything changed. So a lot of warning signs, and we need to be extremely alert. And this then is the challenge. The culture of fear has taken root in the United States. A lot of people are not speaking out, are fearful, are frightened. And once that culture of fear takes place, it's much easier for the forces of darkness to wreak havoc. And it imposes obligations on you, both, on me. How courageous are we going to be in speaking out and calling a spade a spade? And, as you posed your question, I ask myself the question, if I say what I really think, as I have, am I going to pay a price for it? And the answer to that question is yes, possibly. And I think we have to be prepared to pay that price. And we have to deal with the realities that there may not be midterm elections. I was astonished by the number of people who said to me there aren't going to be midterm elections in the United States. There isn't going to be a presidential election in 2028. Highly connected, highly informed, not scaremongers, extremely concerned about where this is going because they have a sense of history. They've seen what happened in South America. They know what happened in Germany in 1933. They know that a constitution is essentially a piece of paper supported by political will. And when that political will evaporates or disintegrates or is shredded, what is left? That's the reality that we are facing right now. What is the value and the weight of the United States Constitution? And we don't know the answer to that question. We hope that the Constitution will survive. I mean, we've been having discussions at home and with people, how did McCarthyism come to an end? What exactly was the root? And we don't know. And we've got to hope that the Constitution of the United States is robust, that the judges are robust, and that the principles I care about are robust. I miss the United States. I mean, it seems to be tragic what is happening in the United States, and it's like a safety blanket in many ways that has been pulled away, and that is discombobulating and frightening even. But it's a reality. We've just got to deal with the reality of the situation and not pretend it's not happening. It is happening. Read about Pinochet to understand what happens when you cross one line. One thing leads to another. This didn't work, so let's go to the next step. And very soon you are in a horrific situation.
But also, crucially, as you write in the book, you cross that line. And if you have allies who support you, then you can keep crossing it far longer. There's a really striking part of the book where you write about Henry Kissinger going to visit Pinochet, for example, in Chile, and that support from America for Pinochet and what he did. So we're back to kind of the age of impunity, I guess, the theme again, and the role of other countries in holding somebody who's doing that to account.
Kissinger visits Pinochet. A month later, Carmelo Soria is assassinated. The head of the UN office is assassinated. And a couple of months after that, Orlando Letelier, Allende's former defense minister, is murdered on a street in Washington, D.C. The visit of Kissinger sent a very strong signal to Pinochet. And the day after the death of Letelier in Washington, Pinochet meets the great Argentine writer Borges, who comes out of the meeting and says, Pinochet's a great man. So, political allies, great writers, we know how these things are done. But eventually in Chile, there was a change. There was a referendum in 1988, and Pinochet thought he would win it, and he lost it, and he left office. He had an immunity under an amnesty law. He had an immunity as a senator. He came to Britain. He got medical treatment, and he was arrested. And he spent 503 days incarcerated under pretty decent conditions, but in a house in which he wasn't even allowed to go out into the garden without the yes of a police officer. So he goes back. His immunity is stripped. He is charged. He's indicted. He dies under house arrest. And the whole Pinochet case in Britain catalyzed change in Chile. And for the first time, there were proceedings. And one of the main characters in my book, the young waiter, El Mosito Jorgelino Vergara, becomes the key witness who puts dozens and dozens of Pinochet's closest colleagues in prison for life on witness testimony. So it's a grim story. It's a dark story. It's a story where people are divided as to the outcome of whether Pinochet's arrest was good or was bad, but it was not without its consequences. And, as a famous poet once said, there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in, and that's how we go on.
You represented Palestine at the ICJ in a case about the Israeli occupation, and in July last year, the court issued an opinion that the occupation uh, must end. Basically, that it's unlawful, and Israel is obligated to end it. And you said at the court, when it was hearing the final arguments in the case, that the right of self-determination for Palestine requires that UN member states bring Israel's occupation to an immediate end. No aid, no assistance, no complicity, no contribution to forcible actions, no money, no arms, no trade, no nothing. Beyond vindicating Palestinian rights, what impact do you think that case has had since then? I mean, given the crisis we're in at the moment in Israel Palestine, do you think that it's changed the way that other UN member states see Israel's position internationally? Do you think it's helped the Palestinians in practice?
Well, the case was premised on a concept known as the right of self-determination, the idea that a community must be free to determine for itself its future direction. And the court affirmed the existence of that principle, affirmed the application of that principle to the occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza, and came down with a very clear statement of what the law is. Now, the law is not being respected. That is clear. And one has to be honest and recognize that. But what the advisory opinion did was strengthen the commitment and persistence of those who do believe in a rules-based system and who do say that what's going on is not justifiable in legal terms and has to end, and is the basis for a lot of countries' support for a Palestinian state. The vast majority of countries in the world now do support the idea of a Palestinian state. Those who don't is diminishing very rapidly. And for the first time, we have some EU member states who've now recognized Palestinian statehood: Spain, Ireland, I think one other country. And I think that advisory opinion has strengthened the move in that direction and made more stark the position of other countries that don't yet want to recognize Palestine. It's also had, I think, practical consequences in the United Kingdom. I mean, we have a government now that is committed to the rule of law. We have a Foreign Secretary and Attorney General personally who believe in the idea of a rules-based system, and I think it has strengthened their hand, probably, I don't know, I'm not involved in the actual discussions, on what is right and what is wrong. And we see that expressed in various different ways. I mean, my own hope is that the British government recognizes Palestinian statehood. I don't see why the state of Palestine being recognized should be something that Israel should have any say on whatsoever. When Israeli statehood was determined nearly 80 years ago, it was a decision of the General Assembly, and it was imposed on the world, and it was imposed on countries and the population of Palestinians. So why not have the same approach now? So I'm not in favor of a sort of negotiated determination that Palestine should be a state. I think the rest of the world is free to make that determination and free to impose it upon Israel. Equally, the converse of that is Israel has a right to exist, and has a right to exist safely within its borders established in accordance with international law. And in a curious sense, the advisory opinion has the effect of providing and buttressing support for Israeli statehood, because it is premised on the international court's recognition of Israeli statehood, and it undermines the arguments of those who say Israel has no right to exist as a state. So these things are complex. People in the press and the media and commentators really sort of pick and choose the bits and pieces that they like and that they don't like about a particular decision or whatever, or a particular situation. And I think the ruling of the ICJ and the advisory opinion was a very good ruling and a very serious ruling. Obviously, it's not being fully implemented, and I hope it will be in due course.
Do you think that I mean, you said that you think the British government, you think that that ruling has given it kind of the possibility to take a more, I guess, a more critical stance on Israeli rights violations. Do you think that the government is sort of doing enough?
Whether they're doing enough, reasonable people will have different opinions. They have stopped some arms sales, and some people will say they haven't stopped enough arms sales. I mean, of course, the elephant in the room is the United States. And what this really turns on is, well, matters historical, the relationship of Britain with the Balfour Declaration, and its relationship with the United States. And, I happen to be married to an American who never ceases to remind me that the first time she came across the idea of a special relationship between Britain and the United States was when she moved to Britain. She'd never heard of it in the United States. And I think we're now seeing in these days the real limits of that so-called special relationship. The current administration has no particular interest, I think, in the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom is now going to have to decide what it's going to do on a raft of different issues. Palestine, Israel is one of them. Tariffs is another, and issues of impunity and immunity in relation to the International Criminal Court and these historic matters are all, in the mix. But I mean, I think one of the things that we can say, seeing the position of this government, for example, on Ukraine, which I'm very attached to because of all the work I've done on East West Street and beyond, we have got a grown-up government, and I think they are. I think what we can say is they're thinking about these issues incredibly seriously.
Well, Philippe, thank you so much for chatting to us for such an interesting conversation this morning. It's been really brilliant to talk to you, and best of luck with your trip to Chile and the mayhem that is ensuing there. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for all your work.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.